I'm Ethan Wong, and today I'm here speaking with Daniel Tysdal. The first question that I usually ask everyone that comes on is kind of a general question because I think it offers a lot of insights into how different people approach poetry differently, which is how did you first fall in love with poetry? And more specifically, what kind of changed you from a reader of poetry into wanting to be a writer of one?
Ooh, great question. Yeah, I would say, what I first fell in love with poetry, I would say probably later in my schooling in terms of, like we did some stuff in elementary school when you're a little kid, but I would say it was kind of like around grade 9 when we got introduced to some Canadian poets, and then one like a classic for Canadians, Leonard Cohen. I first discovered his work and his music, and so that was definitely a big influence. And so I'd say, yeah, kind of that start of high school for me is when I really had some good teachers, who taught a nice range of the old kind of classic poetry, but lots of contemporary Canadian stuff. And then, yeah, it was actually when I was 15 that I just like woke up in the middle of the night one night and I grabbed this notebook off my shelf and I just had these like this couplet in my head and I just like wrote it down. And then the next morning I got up and I turned that into a poem, and then I filled that notebook. And I remember that I was 15 because then it was my 16th birthday when my parents, one of the gifts they gave me was a big brand new notebook for me to keep. They noticed that I was into this writing thing, and so they wanted to support that. So that was definitely the moment where just writing poetry became, pretty much like breathing for me, just every day, always thinking about it, always doing it.
Yeah, and I think something really interesting you mentioned there is that kind of introduction to contemporary poets within the schooling system. And it's like, I think, at least where I am, we're definitely getting a little better about it now.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because I just finished 12th grade, and as it's a little weird because I feel like the older I've gone, the more they introduce me to contemporary poetry, even though I feel like the younger I am, the easier it is to
Yes.
connect with contemporary instead of
Yes.
more traditional poetry.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, like I think that's such an important thing, is just to get into contemporary poetry. And like, because I almost feel as though when you're looking at traditional poetry, there's this obligation to replicate that kind of poetry,
Yeah.
which is like not really what you want to do anymore. It's kind of do
Yeah.
your own thing, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. One comment I'll throw in there, this is getting ahead to lots of other stuff we're going to talk about. But I would say, like, for me, one of the things that, because of course, yeah, I'd been introduced to Shakespeare and sonnets, just to take one example, and it's like, I really dug that. And so when I was like 15, 16, there I was writing sonnets with no idea that this would be something that would be almost like impossible to publish, especially since, I was writing them in just like a bad Shakespearean like ripoff, like the diction is all wrong, like it just sounds really old school. But I do think, like, at poets at any point in our career, but I think especially when we're emerging, it's still fun and important, to go down those pathways, because boy, did I learn how to tune my ear. Boy, did I learn about rhyme, and rhythm and all these things that I still like to come back to. But even as a predominantly free verse poet, that knowledge that I gained, from doing that is kind of always with me, and just that awareness that this is something you can explore. So I do think, yeah, in the end, I think that's a great thing about poetry is we kind of can't go wrong. As long as
Yeah.
we're reading it and writing it, it's like you're doing it right.
Yeah, and that's a thing that I've heard a lot, and I think it's really important because I think even I have a lot of issues with, like, I write something down and I'm like, oh, I feel like this is, wrong, but
Yeah.
kind of takes some getting over. And I kind of wanted to explore your work specifically. I know that you've written some fold-in poems, I think you call
Yes.
them, in the past. And I want to ask, like, I think the concept is super interesting that you have the final line already written in kind of everything else
Yes.
that you've already
Yeah.
like plotted out, but then you need to kind of almost alter the poem to get to the final line.
That's for sure.
And I kind of want to ask, like, what kind of got you to that idea? Why do you like that idea so much?
Yeah, so there's kind of a couple phases to that. So it started out as a kid. I fell in love with Mad Magazine when I was about 6 or 7 years old, And so my parents started buying it for me. And then my uncle, had loved it when he was a kid. So he gave me like like the 1960s, like every issue of Mad Magazine. So it had a huge influence on my creativity and my sense of humor and all that. And every issue ends with this mad fold in, as you've said, where you fold over the page, and in Jaffe's case, the picture becomes something different. And then so when I started to become a poet who was interested in experimentation, I thought, oh my goodness. So this would have been in like the early aughts. I was like, I would love to write a mad fold-in poem. That would be a cool thing to do. But then, yeah, I would write the poem, and then I'd be like folding it, and then like, wait, my last line is like, the at bear be sink. It's just like a random like nonsensical thing. So it was finally in around like, I think it was like 2004 or 5 when I finally like, like it hit me. It's like, oh, yes, get a poem idea. But once you kind of have that idea, you got to figure out your last line. And then you can start to hide those words throughout the poem and start working them in to do that. And so I had a fold-in poem to end my first book of poems in 2006. And then, just people listening, a trigger warning, mental illness, discussions of suicide. Then in like, whenever it was, like 2016, maybe, I just had as I've had throughout my life, a terrible, mental health crisis. And I was just so sick, didn't sleep for days, and just had this line in my head at night. I just felt like my brain was burning. I felt like my brain was on fire. And so I jotted that line down, and I started just writing all this, really kind of, dark, negative things, just trying to bring these terrible thoughts out. And I still went to school on the Tuesday to teach. And maybe that wasn't wise, maybe I should have gone to the hospital instead. But it ended up being good, just like I had, even though everything was in turmoil in my head, seeing the students, teaching, discussing with them really helped. And so that created this turn in this idea I had of like, yes, these voices in my head are all destructive and they're kind of terrible artists, but look at all the positive artists sort of outside me who inspire me. And so I thought, my goodness, what a perfect moment of madness, to come back to the mad fold-in poem and to start exploring that again. And so there I was finally at a point in my life where I was comfortable writing about a lot of these experiences that I'd always been afraid to write about. And we live in a society that's more open and interested in hearing these stories now, and hearing these experiences. So that's been the poetry project that I've been working on basically since then. So I just wrote a whole book of them, chapbook, and then got the book of full poems coming out in the fall. So that was one of those, just like really special experiences where, yeah, aesthetically, it was an amazing experience to think of all the different ways. Oh, a fold-in sonnet, a fold-in pantoum, a fold-in visual poem. Like, how can we hybridize? But also just at a personal level of like facing things, learning things about myself, getting empowered through that knowledge that poetry can give us.
Yeah, and that's so interesting to me. So many things that you mentioned, and there's no way I'd ever be able to get to all of them. But one thing I wanted to ask about is, in your experience, and this might be a bit of a personal question, so just let me know if that happens to be the case. But in your experience, what is it like in terms of the relationship between your mental health and writing? Because I think that's been such a big thing for me, and I hear for a lot of other people too. I kind of want to ask, what has your experience been with that?
Yeah, great question, and very happy to answer it. I mean, it's really at the root of what I do. You know what I mean? It's really what brought me to poetry, what brought me to that page. As a high school student, as an undergraduate student, I got very sick at the start of my undergrad, and I quit, undergrad once. I got kicked out once, put on academic probation. It took me 8 years to finish my degree, etc. But the uniting feature was always poetry there as like keeping me stable, keeping me connected. What an amazing community. Look, here's you and I don't know one another from anything, just kicking up a conversation immediately, right? And so I love that about poetry, the community that was there. And so, yeah, it's like, I've definitely gone through phases, as you develop, where it's like, oh, I learned more about publishing, and I learned more about awards, and I learned more about that. And so suddenly that became a bit of a driver. And, you have some successes, you have some failures, but it's like, I found like that could often lead to kind of like a negativity, because then I was thinking about my poetry more like, oh, how do I write a publishable poem? how do I write a poem that might win this poetry contest, instead of just like, how am I writing the poems that are like in me? How are writing the poems that are gonna like save me and help me, you know, whether me personally through these, you know, this mental health journey, or through just sort of like understanding the world and through connecting with other people. So yeah, I'd say it's kind of like always been at the root. And you know, I think too, you go through a phase too where it's like art, high art, great art. It's not about therapy. It's about great ideas and brilliant form, right? And so, you know, I went through a phase when I was, yes, forget helping yourself, be brilliant and great, you know, like that. And I was just like, no, that's nonsense. Like, yes, it can be, you know, if we need it, it can be that therapy. And I just think the more that, for me personally, that I remember that has, you know, that's a big part of this journey, just the better I feel as a writer, the better I feel about writing. And just, you know, I'm sure you've heard this a million times, but it's just like, the process is all we have, right? That's the only thing that is always there. And it's a guarantee, you know? And so that get wrapped up in that and get value and sustenance from that. And it's like, there is a great life, you know, as a poet.
Yeah. And that is so interesting to me too, because I have had like thoughts, especially at the kind of like Asian phase I'm at, about very similar thoughts about like, oh, how would I write a publishable poem, or like a meriting poem, something that merits, a poem that merits something.
Yes.
And I think that's something I'm still very much going through at the current phase, where it's like, I want to write what, well, simply put, I want to write what I want to write, but it's like,
Yeah.
at the same time, there are the things that I want to write, the right things to write about.
Yes,
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like, that's kind of something that I'm dealing with always whenever I put down, or for me, it's like when I open a Google Doc and I get started on a poem. So I think it's very interesting to hear someone else talk about that.
Yeah.
I kind of want to actually talk about something I think you mentioned earlier, where you were talking about like the diction in terms of like you writing your first Shakespearean sonnets and stuff. How do you distinguish, if you do at all distinguish actually, between the way you would write prose normally and how you write your kind of phrasing and your sentence structure when you write poetry? Because I think I've seen a lot of variants. Like some people write poetry as if it's completely different from prose, just
Yeah.
the phrasing, the structure is totally different. And then some people write it basically as if you're writing sentences.
Yeah. 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 Well, yeah, that's such a great question. And I mean, yeah, it's a difficult one in a good way. And I would say, like, for me, you know, the majority of my prose tends to be writing fiction. And so and so that's been like a big part of my learning journey as a writer, where it's like poetry came to me right away. You know, I understood it, the voices were there, the forms, etc. And then my short stories were basically, they weren't prose poems, because there were kind of characters, you know, and there was like the glimmering of a story, but it was like no story that any reader of stories would want to read, you know, and as proven by the fact that I never published any of it, or, you know, I would share it with my friends, or, you know, and they would just be like, what is happening here? I'm like, oh, it's like two people are, you know, arguing over some beers. And it's like, what, where is that happening in here? You know, because there's like 5 metaphors, you know, in every paragraph. And so, yeah, I would say, as I've kind of settled into both, you know, finding a bit more success with writing fiction, I'd say in the end, it all, for me, comes out of a certain voice, just inhabiting voice in the body, in the words, you know, and thinking about audience, I would say, as well too, and just thinking about what an audience wants. And so when I'm writing a poem, I'm just like, it's almost like the audience is what I'm writing about. It's almost like the audience is what I'm listening to, that experience, or the birds that I'm looking at and wrote a poem about. You know what I mean? It almost feels like there, because you just know that a poetry reader, they just want to go with you. You know, that the poetry reader just almost wants you not to think about them. So you're just kind of like doing your thing, and they want to see the movement of your mind, or the patterns and the connections you notice. Whereas, you know, obviously there's experimental fiction, but if we get into, you want anyone to be able to kind of enjoy your story, that's where you got to think about them so much. And it's like, what does my protagonist want? You know, what are the obstacles? Like, how do I seduce a reader? You know, I think a lot more about seduction when I'm writing a short story, of like, how do I hook them? How do I, there's a little bit of tease. How do you give the little payoffs, et cetera. So yeah, I'd say those are the two big things of just sort of like how that voice feels in me, and then thinking about audience in different ways.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to put it, especially because I've heard a lot of people talk about how poetry feels like a very honest form in terms of like it's a very open one because you're opening yourself up to whoever's reading the poem. Whereas like maybe with fiction, as you would put it, you're kind of appeasing them. So you're not really opening yourself up. You're kind
Yeah,
of just catering yourself to them, right?
yeah,
And I
yeah,
think that's a big difference with poetry and why poetry is so appealing too, because it's like you get to just kind of be yourself if you want.
yeah, yeah. And I think too, connected to the way you put it too, I think poetry can be more about that opening up. And then fiction is more about that deception. It's like, if you're writing like a mystery story, it's like the writer knows how it ends, right? They could say on the first page, it's like, oh, like Colonel Mustard is the killer. But it's like, no, I'm going to deceive you, reader. And I'm going to make you think the killer was 5 different people. And I'm going to be deceiving you this whole way through that kind of joy, that readerly pleasure that comes from being deceived.
Yeah. And another thing I wanted to ask, because I think I've tried to introduce people to poetry who have themselves, I think, close themselves off from poetry just
Right.
from what they've experienced so far, or just telling themselves they can't write poetry. And so I kind of almost am soliciting your advice on this in terms of you've spoken on and you've written about like how everyone can write poetry.
Yeah.
And how do you convince someone of that, like directly to their face, just talking about it?
I mean, you actually raise a good question. I might maybe we'll have to like collaborate on a future YouTube thing where it's like Ethan and Daniel make other, kind of like in the street. We'll just like randomly pick strangers and be like, we're going to get you to write a poem right now, and see if we can do it. But yeah, like I would say, to take an example of just what happened in the classroom. Like, say for example, like I used to teach a huge literature, English class where it was like introduction to poetry. And we had to do a kind of like so-called, English canon, but we had a lot of leeway, to keep it, just interesting and progressive. So but along with the anthology, I would always teach a book by a local author, a full collection, local author who I could bring to class. And so a lot of people would have to take this class because it was an elective, but it fit a requirement, for their science degree, or for their economics degree. So they were there because they're like, this is going to be easy. I hate poetry, but I'll get an easy grade, blah, blah, blah. And some of them would leave still not caring about poetry. But yeah, for a lot of them, it would be just that introduction to, first of all, people are like, wait, people still write poetry? And it's like, what? Oh, people write poetry in Toronto about Toronto, right? And so I think a part of it can be, if I look at these cases, it's connecting the poetry to their experience, right? To something that they care about, say their city, or maybe if someone had a passion for bird. Why do I keep bringing up birds? I guess I love birds, right? Maybe some bird poetry. Maybe they love sports, some sports poetry, and again, something that's contemporary, right? So it's more kind of accessible to them. I think that can be a way to at least get people, because yeah, they don't know, they don't even know what it is, what they don't like, right? They just think, I don't like poetry.
Yeah.
It sounds like scary and like I'm too dumb for it, or just all the often some negative self-talk on that person's part. So I think, yeah, if you can connect it to them, to their interests or their community in some way, I think that can be a way to get people excited. And yeah, again, I think if anyone's willing to take that step with the writing, like I do in the TEDx talk or in my textbook, The Writing Moment, like that really does start to begin with those exercises where it's like, that was the whole shtick with The Writing Moment, is it's like practice precedes abstraction. So you get a prompt and you write, and you're writing through your experience. So you don't need to know anything, right? Just follow this prompt. And suddenly it's like, there's the practice, and here's the abstraction. You just wrote imagery. Here's the definitive imagery. You have a tool now, right? It's like, do this next prompt. You just wrote a metaphor. Here's what a metaphor is, right? So instead of being like, blah, 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 metaphor, 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 da, da, da. And now someone's like, what is that? Okay, so the tenor and the vehicle, right? get people at their heart, at their body, at their mind, and then you can tell them kind of what they did. And so I do believe that everyone has like poetry in them, and will gain from writing it, from the connection to their language, to their experience. But again, it's not like everybody's going to believe us saying that.
You make such a good point with the practice precedes abstraction thing, because I think even my own writing has been in a lot of points like that, where I've written something and then I'll go and say, okay, this is actually could very well, if I just tune it a little, become like this practical, like this traditional form, or this
Yes.
traditional device or whatever. And it's like, we naturally, the reason why those are devices in the first place, or forms, is because you kind of naturally go to them. And then so all you need to do is those small adjustments to actually get there. And it's not that hard. And then it becomes a lot easier because you realize I'm already kind of doing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well said. I like that.
And kind of before we go on to a reading of a poem, I wanted to ask one last question, which was kind of actually a little selfishly targeted at writers like me, where I was just going to ask, like, because I feel a little as if I'm in a standstill right now in terms of, I want to, in the past, I wrote a lot about nostalgia, family, love, and stuff. And I want to kind of expand my horizons. I want to write about more things. I want to kind of almost get past a certain like invisible barrier I feel like I'm stuck in terms of, I'm always writing about the same things. I'm always writing the same way.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I'm becoming accomplished in any ways, not just like the like external accomplishments, like even for myself.
Yeah.
So have you ever experienced anything like that? What kind of advice would you give about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there are a few different things you can do. I mean, one, I wouldn't worry about, I wouldn't even that kind of framing, I wouldn't necessarily, even though you're right to say it, a kind of expansion, I wouldn't make that a concern, as the end goal, instead of just like getting writing about something that's driving you, that you're passionate about, that you can't kind of help but write about. So I would sort of take that as the process, so to take me as a personal example, my first book, Predicting the Next Big Advertising Breakthrough Using a Potentially Dangerous Method, was a series of poems that were, what if lyric poetry, but the language of poetry, or poker? What if lyric poetry, but the language of advertising, or poetry fold-in poem, poetry visual art? So it was a whole book of hybrid poems. Again, it didn't start that way. I was just writing. I was like manic, depressed, feeling a lot, just like, and then suddenly you got 15 poems. You're like, oh, wait, these are all hybrid poems. I'm going to keep doing this, right? So letting that initial exploration happen that way. But I sort of like did that book. And then so as I was now like, oh, I'm an author, I have a book, I was like, okay, I need to write just traditional poems, and they just have to be flush left, and they're lyric poems, and and then it was just like that. Even though I was like, I'm going to try something new, it was just like death to my poetry, right? It was just like, it just wasn't me, And so suddenly I was like, well, I'm writing about this, and I let these layers kind of develop, and a whole kind of project kind of arose out of that. So I think that's a part of it, of just that framing of just sort of like letting yourself go where your passion and your imagination and your excitement takes you. I would say for me, some of the more like, so yeah, when I'm stuck, what do I do? One thing is I always try to make sure I have a couple things on the go that are very different. So maybe I have, like right now, I'm finishing up the poems. And so I'm kind of looking for new stuff. So it's like, oh, I'm starting a novel. I'm working on a little short film. I'm helping a friend with a feature film. So it's kind of like, you can kind of, when you're like, the novel's just like, I have nothing, right? You can kind of bounce over to something else. And then, yeah, like I would say, like, obviously, the obvious thing, just read a ton of poetry, and just find those poems that just kind of animate you and get you going. But also it's like, what are other arts that we love, right? So it's like, yeah, I love movies. So I love noir movies, so watch some noirs. I love slasher movies, so watch some slashers. It's like, who knows what that will generate, and who knows what kind of that will spark. I would say that, yeah, like going to an art gallery, just doing stuff like that to get those juices going. But yeah, I would just like, and I hear everything I'm saying, I still do. Like I get in that mindset, like, oh, I have to do this now with my poetry, or this is what I have to do next. And often, yeah, that can just be like the opposite effect. Whereas you're saying you're just like stuck. So how do you get that kind of organic, just like spark, and I think it is sort of like letting yourself be yourself, and also just, pushing in non-poetry directions and exploring that way and see what that sparks in you.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely gonna, I have been thinking about doing non-poetry projects and stuff
Good.
to kind of flush out. I think I need it's like a cleanse, and then I'll get right back into it.
100%. Yeah. Because I it's so funny, like, my wife and I have been together now for like 15, 16 years, 15, yeah. And like every time I finish a big poetry project, I'm like, that's it, done with poetry. I said everything I need to say. I got nothing else for poetry, I'm only fiction now, or only this, or I'll just focus on my teaching. Cut to, 6 months later, a year later, she's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm writing a poem. Yeah, leave me alone.
Yeah, that's great. And I think poetry, it's like ever since I started it, poetry has become a part of my life that I can't exactly shake. And even if I stop writing poetry now, I know it's going to catch up with me later. So it's like,
it's always there. And I'm sure you've heard lots of people, this you've probably already experienced too. It's like that thing where you're like, maybe because you can't write, or maybe because, school or your job is just keeping you from doing any writing for 6 months. And it's like, you don't lose any ground, because then when, if suddenly you get 2 weeks to write or a month to write, it's like you'll write as many poems in that month as you would have written over 7 months, because it really does kind of like accumulate in you. And when you do have that chance to sit down and do it, it will just sort of like come bursting out.
Yeah. And that's really encouraging to hear, for sure. Thank you for that. And if you're ready, we could get into the reading of the poem.
Okay, yeah. So I'll read one of the Mad Folden poems, and this one is about writing poetry, which I thought would be fitting. I will show this because this is a classic thing that writers do. If I do stumble over my reading, it's because even after you publish things, so this is in my Mad Folden chat book, even after you publish things, you still edit things because you're not happy with it. So if I stumble over my own handwriting, I apologize. So this poem's called Make. Why bother writing a poem? The future breaking away doesn't want it. Even if your lines are a monument to their moment, tomorrow's fools will legislate new rules and blast your statue, or extinct themselves into stillness, the leveling left to sand and time. The present's no different. Your poem may erect a sustaining abode, but this home at best ends up backgrounding a blockbuster scene shared by the comic book villain and his city obliterating bursts. And the past? Forget it. Compose a time-traveling lyric that can explore ancient centuries, and it'll catch a lethal influenza, its immunity lost, or it'll sustain no senses or souls with its vision. If only poems didn't need to be monuments and homes and heroes. If only poems were seeds. It's no crisis that most crack, rot, or blow away. The forest made and remade over centuries through the germinating few. If only poets were the mythological creatures we never knew, part skin, part song, part failed reach, and nailed loss. If only writing poems was the same as making bread, the same workaday labor, or the same as bread itself, a practice that can break and still be shared, can sustain, and is made new each day.
Thank you. That was great.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
And thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Ethan. This is really fun.